Welcome to Summit. We are going to be kicking off our pathway, Leading Through Conflict, 7 Ways Leaders Demonstrate a Peacemaker Mindset. Today, we will be doing session 1, where we'll be focusing on active responses to conflict. Although conflict is inevitable, the actions you take at the very beginning of a conflict often determine the outcome. And in this session, we'll explore the practices of reaching out, perspective taking, expressing emotions, and creating solutions. Not only can leaders master these practices in themselves, they can also help create a culture that supports these practices when conflicts emerge. I'm Lorianne Shaw, and I am going to be introducing our expert panel here with us today. We have Joey Cope. Joey Cope is the Dean of the College of Graduate and Professional Studies and Associate Vice President for Academics at ACU Dallas. Joey is the past chair of the State Bar of Texas Alternative Dispute Resolution Section and a recipient of that organization's Justice Frank Evans Award for the field. I would also like to note that Joey is the founding executive director for Duncombe Center Solutions. And we also have Brenda McAdoo joining us. Brenda has been a special agent for the Federal Bureau of Investigation for over 23 years. Brenda's worked crimes against children, violent crime, and organized crime. Throughout this work, she was a member of an organized crime task force that investigated groups committing extortion, kidnapping, and murder for hire. Brenda lives with her husband and 5 children in Tarrant County. Welcome, Brenda. And we have Fernando Nasmyth. Fernando has served on the boards of several nonprofit organizations, including the Greater Atlanta Christian School Board of Trustees, on which he currently serves as chair. And Fernando retired at the end of 2017 from a career in legal operations and finance with several large public and privately held businesses. He and his wife, Donna, have 3 adult children. Welcome, Fernando. And I would like to note all 3 of our panelists here today are experts in conflict management. And actually these 3 all have law degrees. And so that's something that we should note as well. As we kick off today, I want to just set some definitions for us and key up the framework that we're going to be looking at today for these active responses in conflict. This will take about 10 minutes, and then we'll transition into our discussion with our panelists here. It's important to note that the way we're defining conflict for the purposes of this session is when there are incompatible goals at stake, perceived incompatible goals at stake. And so this picture is a picture of my family where you can see just by looking at it that everyone had different goals when we were taking this picture. So if you look here at the one person who's actually looking at the camera, me, I really wanted to have some family pictures taken at the time when my children were 1 and 3. And my husband, you can see here, is smiling and getting a kick out of our children. He was interested in having pictures taken, but really wasn't too excited about having the pictures taken. He is, however, very interested in and gets a kick out of our children. We were at a park here, and so you can see my daughter. She is brandishing that stick and so proud, and that's what she was most interested in at the time of this picture. And my son down there, who's 1, he was very focused on wanting to play with his sister, and I think he was very interested in that same stick. And so here we were taking family pictures, and we all had different goals in mind that day. And so I like to start off with this just so maybe you can identify. Maybe sometimes you find yourself at church, maybe sitting in worship or sitting in a small group or sitting in a Bible class, and you notice everyone here seems to be focused on something a little bit different. And so to note that is normal. That is a normal experience we have. And so as we introduce the conflict dynamics model, I want to note the assumption, the goal, and the focus from this model. The assumption here is that conflict is inevitable. And the reason that's important is it really sets our expectation. If we as church leaders are in church assuming that if we do a good job, if we have good congregants, if we have good systems and processes, that conflict will not happen, then we are very disappointed when it does. And so if we change our expectation, and our expectation is that conflict will happen, that it is inevitable, and that conflict is actually a very normal and natural part of congregation life, just that switch and that assumption change can be very, very powerful, because then we are not surprised and we welcome it, and we don't deem ourselves as leaders or our congregants as bad when it happens. We just assume it is inevitable. And if we make that assumption that conflict is inevitable, then our goal changes from not having conflict at all. It changes to reducing the harmful impact of conflict, which many of us have experienced and been wounded by, especially at church. And we change then our focus to maximizing the benefits of conflict. And so we then change how we view conflict. Our mindset shifts to viewing conflict as opportunity for transformation, opportunity for change. But it's very important that we acknowledge the goal here of maximizing the benefits of conflict, but oftentimes we don't even acknowledge as conflict when it goes well. We say, well, we went through a transformation, or we went through a change, and we don't even use the label conflict when it goes well. And so our focus in this model then is going to be on the specific behavior changes and shifts. And so it's so easy to get frustrated and fatigued in conflict. We can feel out of control. And what I love about this model is that it refocuses our control on our own behavior and our own responses, which is very powerful. Another important piece, just to set up our conversation here, is the progression of conflict that's noted in the conflict dynamics model. The conflict dynamics model notes that conflict begins when we are triggered, when our hot button is pushed. And so you know when your hot button is pushed because you start feeling annoyed. You feel irritated. You feel that in your body in some way. Most of us have a tell of some sort. My husband told me after about 15 years of dating and marriage, he said, I know exactly what you do when you're irritated, Lori. When you're triggered, you tap your foot, you kick your foot up and down, and I know then you're annoyed with me. And having that feedback has been some of the most valuable feedback in my life, because I didn't even know that about myself. And so simply recognizing what triggers us and then how that manifests in our body, that is key here to then understanding that then we have a choice to make in how we're going to respond. Are we going to respond in a way that is constructive? And we know it's constructive because we stay task focused and we notice that tensions ease. And so the conflict de-escalates when we respond constructively. But most often, if we don't recognize that we've been triggered and we just give our knee-jerk response, which really is to protect and defend ourselves, that's just a human part, a way we are made as humans, when we perceive threats, when we are scared, when we're triggered, we will respond to protect and defend ourselves. And most often we get focused on a person. And so we tend to blame and we tend to lash out, again, to protect ourselves, but that often results in tensions escalating and the conflict growing in a negative way. So think about this as today we're going to be focusing on this box up here that says constructive responses, and we're going to be teasing out 4 constructive active responses in this session. And so here's the larger model, and I've bolded the responses we're going to talk about today. So you can see here, perspective taking, creating solutions, and expressing emotions, and reaching out. These are constructive responses, and they're also active. And so the difference in active and passive responses that you see on this chart here, the active responses actually involve the other person. By definition, you cannot do one of these active responses alone. You must do them in conjunction with other people. And if you stay for our next session, we'll be talking about passive constructive responses, and those are done alone. To wind down my part here, I just want to show some definitions of each of these active constructive responses. So perspective taking, we define this as really inviting the other person to help you put yourself in their shoes, to look at the problem from behind their shoulder and really say, tell me how you see this. Listening then to what they share with you is very, very important in taking that perspective. Creating solutions, we define this again as working with the other person to create a solution. Here you have to really believe that whatever you and the other person create together is better than what you could create alone or what they could create alone. And so again, it's done together. Sometimes we struggle with going into a situation with the solution already worked out in our mind, and we love that solution so much, but this model challenges us to not get too married to our own solutions, but to buy into the idea that we can create better solutions with the people that we find ourselves in conflict. And expressing emotions, this is one we're really going to tease out today in a practical way. It is very challenging. So expressing emotion is just simply talking honestly with the other person and expressing your thoughts and feelings. But we have to do that absent of blame, and we have to do that really from our own perspective. And it's more of a sharing, and we have to make sure that we feel safe in doing that the other person feels safe while we're doing that, and we have to really tease out any of those blame words, which is a challenge. And then reaching out. Reaching out is when we make the first move, maybe we notice that there is a misunderstanding, or we notice that we are triggered, and we know that there needs to be a further discussion with another person so that maybe the misunderstandings don't continue. But it's just simply reaching out to say, hey, I would like to go have a cup of coffee with you, or I would like to make sure we come back and meet about that thing you said in small group last week, because I want to better understand what you were saying there. So these are the 4 responses that we're going to dig down on with our expert panel here. Welcome, Joey, Brenda, and Fernando. Really grateful that you guys have agreed to join us here today and share your expertise. I am going to kick us off just with some discussion questions here for our panel. So Joey, if you wouldn't mind, I'll kick the first question over to you. As we think about, as leaders, preparing for these difficult conversations, could you talk a little bit about what needs to happen before you reach out and have a difficult conversation?
Sure. Thank you, Lori Ann. I think that we need to remember one of our constructive responses is working with emotions. And we need to remember that even as leaders, we're entering these conversations with those same emotions. Even if we're not directly involved, maybe we're trying to mediate between 2 other people, but most often leaders are right in the middle of it. So you'll carry those emotions in And there is a term that's used quite often in mediation and peacemaking, also in counseling, which is that we ought to consider ourselves and place ourselves in a non-anxious presence mode where we can absorb things. I'd like to tie that back to one other point. In one of the slides, it was talking about on the constructive responses that that as we prepare for that, as we get ready for that, that we often can take a procedural role with that. We can look at a process and we can be task oriented in what we do. Many years ago, when we first started the Duncan Center, we had a controversy come up in a residence hall at the university. And I was called and was asked to be the mediator for that. And I thought about that, and it was a women's residence hall. All the participants were women. And I had a feeling that perhaps my perspective on what they were dealing with wouldn't quite line up with that particular conflict. And so I called in a couple of our students and asked them to co-mediate that. And they came in and they met in my office right before the mediation. And to complicate things, it was quite a few people in the residence hall. So there were like 15 people involved in the conflict. And so they were quite nervous. They said, how do we do this? What do we do? And I said, all you need to do is relax and work through the steps of resolving conflict. And that takes us through a good process. So the non-anxious presence often comes with you setting out some very simple, direct steps that you'll take as you go through a conversation. And you get that in mind before you go in the room at all. The second thing that you need to remember about non-anxious presence after preparation is the idea that you can absorb just about anything that comes. If someone is upset with you or expresses anger or frustration, the best thing to do is to use some of these other things we'll talk about, like listening, trying to figure out that perspective, and using that to be curious, to ask questions, and to increase your understanding. All those things contribute to the non-anxious presence.
Thank you, Joy. I'm so glad you brought up about the non-anxious presence. Once we're triggered, if we're not aware of that, then it's very difficult to have that non-anxious presence when we are triggered. And so it's a wonderful thing to call out. Brenda, what would you add to what Joey said, and anything else about non-anxious presence?
I would say one of the biggest things that we need to do, especially as church leaders, is be okay with emotion. Because sometimes when you come into it, you have to be aware that other people's emotions, they're not going to deal with things the same way you do. And that preparing yourself in order to take in that emotion that Joey was talking about, you have to be okay with whatever the other person brings. And whether you're mediating or if you're in conflict, as a church leader, if you're in conflict with an elder or a family, then you need to be able to recognize and to label and accept the emotion that they're feeling about whatever the issue is. And I think sometimes we let people vent, but then we just tell them that that's not okay. And so we dismiss the emotion. And one of the best things that you can do for people is to let them go through that emotion, whatever they bring first, know that that's not what they're feeling deep inside. And you've got to break through that first emotion, the anger that they bring or the hurt. Because lots of times what we see is behind anger is fear. Fear of how they're going to be perceived, fear of, losing a friend, fear of not being accepted. And then that behind that fear is either love or the loss of love. And so you really need to work with people through that process that Joy's talking about in order to go through the conflict effectively. And I think being able to, and recognizing in yourself how you feel about emotion is one of the best things that you can do is to prepare for this.
Oh, that's great, Brenda. So I love you're weaving in this idea about it's not just about us expressing our emotion, it's about us receiving others' emotions. And sometimes that may be in a form that's very difficult for us. And so even in receiving that emotion, I hear you challenging us not to be triggered by the other person's emotion, but to allow them to express themselves in sometimes a very raw form, it sounds like. Very good. Thank you. Fernando, what would you add here?
If I may, I'll just add a point that many of our congregations are becoming more multi-ethnic, more multicultural. And there's a cultural aspect to this as well. And so as a leader preparing to engage someone else, I think understanding their approach and how emotion plays into how they handle conflict, I think it's an important aspect to consider and prepare for as well. I think it can show up in how expressive someone is, or how, because of the dynamics of how they view conflict, they may not be expressive at all. And sometimes that lack of expression gets interpreted negatively by someone who feels that passionate expression is really, if you're not showing that, you're not engaging. And so it can have some consequences that you don't intend as well.
Well, that's really helpful. So even so allowing others to express emotions the way that in a way that they are comfortable, and acknowledging that culture, family of origin, all kinds of things can play into how someone expresses emotion, either very passionately or sometimes, like what you're saying, less passionately, which sometimes we understand as the person isn't engaging or doesn't feel strongly when in fact
Correct.
they do. It's very helpful. Let's see, Joey, what about when you're sharing with someone, you're expressing your emotion and they reject your perspective? How might a leader handle that?
Well, first, you can't take it personally. You have to grab that moment and say, well, that's where we are right now. And one of the best things you can do is validate the person. That doesn't mean agree with them, but validate them and say, I understand that you don't agree with me on this. And then that gives us the opportunity to ask more questions. Tell me about what you believe. Tell me about your side of this. Give me your perspective on that. It may be appropriate later on for you when they've done that and you feel like you understand. By the way, it's a good idea for you to repeat back to them what they told you, to see if you fully understand what they've told you. But at the end of that, it would be okay if you feel comfortable saying, would it be okay if I shared my perspective again? Maybe I could explain that better, or maybe I missed something now that I can see what is important to you. But regardless, if it's a rejection, use that as a moment to get a deeper view of their perspective, so that you understand more clearly.
That's helpful. I like the idea of giving ourselves permission to ask, may I share again? Love that. Brenda, when you think about what leaders are facing right now in churches, within the light of the pandemic, in the light of very important political and racial equity conversations, navigating all of those things as a church leader. Churches are some churches are still virtual. Some churches are dipping their toe back into being in person. Which response here do you think would be the most challenging right now?
I think the biggest challenge for church leaders right now in dealing with we've heard that word a lot, an unprecedented year where people don't have the connection with each other that they did because we're not in person, because we're not in big groups. We haven't been able to have an outlet for our emotions, for the political issues, for whatever. So many people are isolated. And I think that has created maybe a perfect storm of people holding emotion in and not having those outlets. And I think that empathy is going to be the biggest challenge for church leaders. And as church leaders start to engage with people who are in conflict in their families, because they've been at home for 6 months with them and children out of school, if you've got families that haven't been able to grieve because they've had a family member die because of COVID and they weren't able to go and be with them, that all of those things then are very personal for the people. And church leaders are going to have to develop and convey empathy if they don't have it naturally. So not all of us have empathy naturally. We don't all deal with emotion in an expressive, understanding way. And so church leaders can learn to develop and convey empathy with their parishioners. And I think that is going to be the biggest challenge in this time when people need that soothing. They need that safe space to have a conversation and without judgment. Right. And Joey said that before, without judgment, that we, and you talked about it when you're talking about the whole construct. And church leaders are going to have to find that safe space where when they're confronted with someone in conflict or in crisis, that they don't dismiss the emotions and that they develop and convey the empathy needed and not just distract them from their pain and not just dismiss the emotions as drama. Right? That we really, really acknowledge with empathy those emotions that they're feeling with. And I think, one of the things about building rapport with people, and especially virtually, right? We're trying to have a conversation, we're trying to build rapport and get across a message. And I think one of the things that from my background that was helpful is I had 20 years as a hostage negotiator. And one of the things that we were taught is to build rapport through active listening. And I think so many people these days try and build it through shared experience or something they all know about, right? So something in common. So being from Texas, it's always good to talk about God's team, right? We can build rapport through talking about the Cowboys or the Stars, or whatever that thing is that's going on right now, or our difficulty with having children in school during COVID. And that is shared experience, but that doesn't draw us into true connection. And I think sometimes our leaders or our counselors then think if we've got something in common, then we're on common ground because we've got something to talk about. But it's not what brings us into true rapport and connection with each other. That's actively listening to each other, which is part of the perspective taking that we're trying to convey. And that active listening along with empathy will get what you really need, is that deeper connection and that rapport building that is so important these days for church leaders especially. We've got so many people hurting in our churches.
Oh, I love what you said about our knee-jerk reaction to build rapport with shared experience versus active listening. I think that's such a common practice. So you really have to disrupt kind of your automatic maybe way of engaging socially, in this moment, and be mindful of active listening. That's wonderful. Fernando, what struck you about what Brenda just shared there?
The idea of building rapport also was important as I was reflected on some of the conversations that I've had is sort of this notion that because we go to church and we've gone to church together for, in our case, we've been at the same church for 36 years. There's this sense that we know each other And the reality is that in particular around conversations on racial injustice, or, you know, that's what's been difficult about the last 3 years in many cases, is that people are having conversation thinking that they know each other because they've shared space for, you know, for a very long time. And what's really happened is conversations didn't take place. And so, you know, there are aspects about how I'm affected by a particular, you know, injustice, let's say, that the person that I'm having conversation with is very surprised that I am feeling that, because they, you know, they've never imagined that I would be, you know, thinking about that way. And so that complicates the rapport building in many cases, because my expectation is, well, I've known you for so long, but you've never been interested in that part of my being, my experience. And the other person is, well, why haven't you said something before now? You know, those kinds of exchanges. So I think it's really important that we be very intentional about having and showing empathy, because I think at the end of the day that really helps to bridge the gap.
Oh, that is such a powerful example. I wonder if you would share more about that, Fernando, and even maybe provide an example or two of how a church leader could do perspective taking well in that moment.
Yeah, I think, and much of what has been said by Joey and Brenda, I think, are applicable here as well. Because part of the value of perspective taking is, how do you start the conversation? And I think too often we find ourselves in these conversations sort of unintentionally, right? We don't, so we're not, you know, our preparation is lacking in many cases, and the surprise element of them, you know, as you mentioned, throws us off, and it directs the course of the conversation to a very negative place. So I think being intentional and preparing to have the conversation is an important step to take initially. I think the other is just perhaps having a different perspective about conflict. I think you mentioned at the beginning that, you know, conflict is unavoidable in many cases, and I think to many leaders, to be in a conversation that we might see as, you know, a conflict, really throws us off, because we don't appreciate the opportunities that we have to make conflict a positive thing. And so I think sometimes getting over that is something that we have to do. But as I reflect on, you know, the conversations that I've had, and let me just say that perspective taking is pretty difficult. I think you've mentioned that as well. When I've had the most success with it is when I have a true desire to understand the other's perspective. And I'm curious. I'm not going into the conversation with the mindset of, I can't believe, and I think we say that often, I can't believe so-and-so believes that, or voted for this. I don't know how anyone could do that. So I think that's a setup for a failed attempt at perspective taking. So I think going into the conversation with a true and genuine desire to understand, and stating that and saying, you know, I really want to know how you are thinking about this, and how your thinking about this leads you to this conclusion. And I will share my perspective that, you know, perhaps gets us to a different place. And the focus of that exchange isn't to persuade, it's really to understand. I think about, was it Stephen Covey that, you know, in his famous book, 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, one of them was seek first to understand and then be understood. And I think that's an important reminder. I think too often we go into these conversations, and my goal is for you to understand what I believe and for me to persuade you that I'm right, and yours is the same. And so we don't take the time or pay attention to listening for understanding. And I think that that's something that would be very important. The other thing is I ask a lot more questions than I make statements, and I try to make sure that we are using the same or similar definition for terms that we may use. And you mentioned not blaming, and I think in many of our conversations, unintentionally, when certain terms are used, people hear accusations that they are, and so you have to be mindful of what those triggers are. I know I've learned what my triggers are, and I try to behave, or as the lawyers would say, govern myself accordingly. But, if you are not aware that certain terms are triggers or hot buttons for the person that you're talking to, then, your conversations can get derailed pretty quickly. I think in today's environment, Black Lives Matter is a trigger, right? It's a hot button. And, if you are not careful about how you use it and explaining what you mean by how you use it, that can, set your conversation very quickly in the wrong direction. White fragility is another one. White supremacy is another one. You're complicit, that's another term. And so there are a lot of terms that are used that if are not explained and you get agreement on your definition, I think those things can make it difficult to put yourself in the other person's shoes, if you will, and understand their perspective, and then give you an opportunity to explain yours. And then hopefully with those efforts, you can, have a positive outcome to your conversation. So.
I'd like to add in here, Fernando triggered some things with me that were positive. So I want to talk about those. This is more of a process tip, but some things are so difficult to talk about. And there is that potential that we will not capture the other person's full perspective if we're not careful and we don't ready ourselves for that. One suggestion for leaders out there is if you have an issue and you can do it this way, plan several sessions with the people that you're working with. And it's perfectly okay to come to a session and say, you know what, I don't think we ought to try to get to a decision today. I think that all we need to do is listen to each other today and get to where we understand each other. And once we do that, we'll pray and we'll come back and we'll try to make a decision another day, or we'll do a little bit more discovery. But just as a piece of process, just give yourself a moment for conversation, but then be able to pause that to where there's not a force to, well, I don't know how long your leaders' meetings last, but many of the churches I've worked with talk about, well, we were talking until midnight on Wednesday night. And I've been part of a leadership group in the past that said, we don't do anything after 10 o'clock because we're not good after 10 o'clock. And so we would look at it and say at 10 o'clock after a Wednesday night service, we're going to talk for an hour or so, and then we're going to come back next week, or we'll come back the next time that we convene. But just take some time to get that perspective. And you can do that by just chopping up the time that you work with that.
Well, that's a very helpful piece of process. Fernando, when you're talking about the being triggered and noticing someone else is triggered, I noticed that I can't really be curious about someone else until I'm curious about myself. And so noticing, for me, after my husband gave me that tip about my foot, for the next week or two, every time my foot went to doing that thing, I would have to make a note about it. And it was one of the most painful things for me over that week to realize all the little moments that trigger me and then the painful part of going, well, what is that? And just the hard emotional work of going, what was annoying me in that moment? What was I afraid of? Brenda mentioned that it's often tied to fear. How was I feeling threatened in the moment? Was it a threat of not having enough time? And so, Joey, you talking about we need to give ourselves multiple sessions so we don't feel the need to, we don't put that pressure on ourselves to come to a resolution or create a solution, when really what we may need is just more time to do perspective taking and expressing emotion, right? I really appreciate that. Brenda, would you add anything to this?
I think the only thing I would add is that we get to choose our response. And that, if you allow yourself, right, that ability, and then trust your ability, God will guide that. And I think that's one of the things as church leaders we need to be praying about, that we need to be choosing our response to people, choosing our response to those triggers. And when you have a congregation which is, I mean, a bit torn, right? All of our congregations are a bit torn right now by those triggers that Fernando was talking about, that you make sure that the leaders are choosing their response intentionally with the Spirit's guidance. And that is just such a good thing that we can maybe work on in each of our lives. That as we choose joy, right? I have a little block of wood in my office. It says choose joy, because you have to choose it every day. Same thing with forgiveness. You can forgive somebody that's wronged you and hurt you, but then you have to continue to choose forgiveness and not bring up the past and not, let that affect your relationship going forward. And so all of those things that we choose, that God asks of us to be intentional in that you're choosing your response to things. So when someone comes at you and pushes your button, like uses one of your triggers, says some word that you feel inside, right? You feel that response where you just want to step forward and get in their space, right? Then if you will step and take your breath and remind yourself that they are God's child. Remind yourself that they're asking you into an argument, right? But that you do not have to show up to every argument you're invited for, but you do have to show up in people's lives. And so that distinction, right? Showing up for people, but not for their argument, I think is key for us right now in a time where crisis and conflict is at the top, and it's in all of the issues. And so I would say choose your response well.
Thank you, Brenda. Absolutely. I think too, just to echo what Fernando was saying about noticing those triggers, as white people in our congregations, we have such an opportunity right now to center Black voices from our brothers and sisters at church. So many wonderful books out there from Black authors who are sharing their perspective with us. And then certainly if we have a Black brother or sister who's willing to share with us at church, I can't imagine a greater gift right now. And so, but I do think that we have to be doing the work outside of those conversations to be curious about ourselves, to understand our own triggers that really we haven't had to do the work on before. And so I think there's so much good opportunity out there right now. We haven't talked a lot about reaching out, and I want to make sure we do that because it's key. You can't actually do these other three things if you don't make it to the conversation with the other person. And so I am curious about how would you advise leaders who reach out and are rejected, or who reach out and find themselves kind of walking into a situation where they're immediately triggered. So I'm going to throw this out there for whoever's interested in picking it up. But what are some of the biggest challenges for leaders right now around reaching out even to have these conversations?
I think given the pandemic and the difficulty in getting together face to face, I think that has presented some challenges for us. I know that in many cases we have told ourselves that these conversations should be conversations that are most effective if they are had in person, right? And so the idea of calling someone or getting on a Zoom call to have a conversation of this nature is not something that we think is desirable or preferred. And so, so that has probably created, I think, for leaders, for elders in particular, an excuse to avoid the conversations because we're waiting for that moment when we can have it in person. But I do think that we are just, I think we have to decide whether it's more beneficial to have the conversation sooner rather than have it in person. And if we're not able to have it in person because of the constraints about, just the nature of dealing with the pandemic, I think we have to opt for having the conversation through whatever medium we think is best. And video is probably good because we can see emotion, we can, see the nonverbals, and at least have that perspective to factor into our conversation. So I would say I prefer to have the conversation sooner. If having it in person is possible, then certainly do that. But I would lean towards having the conversation rather than waiting until you do so much later.
That encouragement not to let the pandemic be a barrier when these conversations still really need to happen, and using the mechanism like Zoom or Google Meet or whatever to have that. Thank you, Fernando. Brenda, would you add anything to that?
Yes, I would. I think another thing that maybe is a barrier for us is our fast-paced, busy lives. And COVID slowed that down some, but now we're ramping back up again, like we missed out on something. And so I think sometimes our fast-paced, busy lives don't give us the ability to stop and really listen to someone in the moment. And, I think sometimes those excuses that Fernando was talking about sometimes come across like this too. Why should we have to solve their problem? They created it. And I don't have time for this. They could have dealt with this before. Like all those kind of questions. But let me ask it a different way. What would your church look like if you treated everyone like they mattered? If we really listened to people in crisis and we reached out in empathy, right? That reaching out sometimes is an apology. Sometimes it's with just a heartfelt, what's going on? What can I do? But we need to reach out, not in dread, and not in dread of not knowing what to say, not in dread of how we'll be viewed, not in dread of how long it will take, but really in true empathy for the other's perspective, for their position, for their experience that we haven't asked about before, for the emotions they're having now due to, whether it's political, whether it's social injustice, whether it's all the things that people are experiencing right now. If we haven't asked before, we need to ask them now. Like now's the time. We can't be afraid to ask them. And we've got to be reaching out, speaking life, and feeling with people. It will make a difference. And that's what we want to do. We want to make a difference. And we've got to make it about them. That's how we'll know that we are truly actively listening to people with the thought of wanting to understand them.
Yes.
I love the what you're highlighting here in the mindset that you have while you're reaching out with expectancy. I look forward to hearing what you have to share with me rather than in dread. And that in dread part, I think, is an automatic human response of feeling like this conversation could could be scary. It could be threatening to our relationship, right? Where what I hear you saying is looking at it as an opportunity to build that relationship and go deeper in that relationship. Thank y'all so much. I want to go around. I want to do two things. I want to mention that in the research, this model comes from organizational research from the Center for Creative Leadership. We have the book linked, and I just want to note that these 4 responses were found to be responses that people expect of leaders. And so the research wasn't that every leader is good at these things. It's just that those who follow others expect the leaders to be good at these things. And so one thing we know, and I think we see this in church a lot, is we expect our leaders, sometimes we hold them to a higher standard than we hold ourselves. And so it's always helpful, though, I think, just to know what others expect of us. And so leaders, I just encourage you to use these responses. People will feel loved by them, that it's worth the effort to be good at them. So to close out, I want to give each of you just one more minute. We'll go back around. Just a final word of encouragement to church leaders here as they choose their responses to the conflicts they're experiencing. Joey, I'll start with you.
So often when we go to talk to church leaders, we end up in Matthew 18 because that's got the 3 verses that tell us how to deal with conflict. And I've often found when I'm talking to leaders and we go through the part about you go to someone who sinned against you and you try to win them over and you take others with you and then you turn it over to the church. And if they don't, if they won't listen to the church, then you get to treat them as pagans and tax collectors. And I've often found that where there's been conflict in the past, that's where people want to settle. They want to say, yeah, so those people we're talking about, they're pagans and tax collectors. We want to treat them that way. And I'm called back to think about what happened right after that in that story, which is when Peter said, Jesus, how many times do we forgive people? And he said 70 times 7. When I talk to people at churches, and oftentimes they would say, we need to take spiritual discipline against these people. We feel like we might need to disfellowship someone. Is that okay? I mean, it says that here in Matthew 18, right? And what I tell them is, if you do that, that is your choice as a leader. If you do that, you need to select somebody to have lunch with them the next day. Because I'm sure that Peter, when he looked at his day timer or his iPhone or whatever he had there to keep up with his dates, said, you know what? We're having lunch with pagans and tax collectors every day this week. And there was a reason for that. Always be willing to go back. Reconciliation is the message of the gospel.
Thank you, Joey. Fernando?
Joey made me think of another passage, I think some Proverbs, and I always invert. So it's I think it's 18:17, and it says, the first to make his case always seems right until the other comes along and challenges them. Right? And really that's what we're talking about. We always go into it thinking that we're right. And it's important for you to know what I'm about to say is right. And I don't really care what you think. But I think, just allowing for the curiosity, the understanding, going in with an idea of understanding what the other person, how are they informed and how does the information that they've relied on shape their conclusions. I think it's an important thing that I would encourage us to do more.
Thank you, Fernando. Brenda?
Pray and love well. I mean, that's what I would say to our leaders who are coming into a conflict themselves or helping others with conflict, is to make sure and start with prayer. Like, pray as you prepare. As Joey talked about, that preparation for your own emotions, for how we start this out. And then as you get into it, listen well. And to be courageous. I think one of the biggest things is we've got to be courageous with our response, with our love, with our empathy. We can't let We can't let society, we can't let whatever's going on outside, we can't let the conflict itself frame our response. We have to choose a response that enables us to come up with creative solutions, enables us to listen to each other and take each other's perspective, that we can look over the shoulder, right? That Lorianne started with, look over the shoulder and see where they're going. When I talk about empathy in other classes, one of the things that I suggest, if you don't have it naturally, that what you can do is find that emotion that you've experienced, because all of us, all church leaders, all members have gone through trouble and hurt and loss. And find an emotion that you have felt before and bring that back up and hold it while you imagine yourself in their situation. Because you're never going to be able to stand in their shoes. None of us are the same. Joey's experience, Fernando's experience, my experience, Lorianne's, yours. Like, all of our experiences are different, but we can hold an emotion and then look at the other person's situation and see how we would feel. And that will help you take their perspective. And then if you listen to their story and their experience and label their emotion, make them feel understood, make them feel important and valued, that will go a long way to reaching out, to actually saying, I'm sorry. And maybe instead of I'm sorry, you say, forgive me, because it asks for a response from the other person. And as church leaders, that's what we're looking for. We're looking that God comes into this moment, this crisis, this conflict, and that we can build rapport and connect with someone so that they can step forward and move into a better relationship with God and others.
Thank you. Thank you all so much, Joey, Fernando, and Brenda, for sharing your expertise here today, for being fellow wrestlers with this this material that we all know is so difficult to live out. And so church leaders, I would say that we're here with you, and we are grateful for your work and your service in our churches. Thank you very much.
Good being with you.
Thank you.